Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
The White Feather Hex by Don Peterson. It all started with a Dutchman, a Pennsylvania Dutchman named Peter Scheinberg, who tilled a weather-beaten farm back in the hills. A strong, wiry man he was. His arms were knotted sections of solid hickory, forming themselves into gnarled hands and twisted stubs of fingers. His furrowed brow, dried by the sun and cracked in a million places by the wind, was well irrigated by long rivulets of sweat. When he went forth in the fields behind his horse and plow, it wasn't long before his hair was plastered down firmly to his scalp. The salty water poured out of the deep rings in his ruddy neck and ran down his dark brown back. As he grew older, the skin peeled and grew loose. It hung on him in folds like the brittle hide of a rhino. It seemed that the more years he spent in his fields behind the plow horse, the more he slipped back into the timeless tradition of his forefathers. He was a proud descendant of a long line of staunch German settlers, commonly known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. He grew up in the fundamental religious sect, having never known any other environment. He was exposed to the sun, soil, and wind from the early days of his childhood, and along with the elements he was also exposed to the evil of the hexerei. The hexerei, or witchcraft, was something that was never doubted or scoffed at by his people. Then why should he, a good Pennsylvania Dutchman, doubt or scoff at such tradition? Perhaps had he moved away from his ancestral lands and had been cultured in modern communities, been educated and raised in other schools, he might have matured. But having no time for any other diversions than might be found on his rustic homestead, he grew up behind the plow horse, tramping in the dark, stony pastureland, eking out his meager existence from the black fields of Pennsylvania. Now Peter's life could have gone on unnoticed among these forgotten hills, except for the strange visit of Martin G. Mirestone, student of German history. It was a cold night when Peter met Mirestone. Peter had been sitting up rather late, pondering over an old, yellowed book by the light of a kerosene lamp. The pale flame flickered about the walls, sending shadows scurrying back and forth, creating all types of weird shapes and designs. Peter huddled over the withered pages, every now and then glancing up at the walls to watch the fantastic games that light and dark were playing. Then, putting his book aside for the night, he prepared to go to bed. He went over to the window to draw the shutters, stopping for an instant to peer out into the gloom along the stony path that ran from his house to an old footbridge about 50 feet away. Curling up from the gorge, mist seemed to play along the rotted planks. It rose and fell in great billowing blankets, sometimes concealing the structure from view. Peter was about to latch the shutter and leave when his attention was focused upon a figure that seemed to emerge from the fog, sort of fading in from nowhere. It made its way across the narrow span like some ghostly apparition. The mist enveloped his legs and clouded his features. Peter drew back in terror, for the mere appearance of the man coming out of the darkness was enough to fill his infant brain with visions of death and hexerei. As the figure drew closer, Peter saw that it was wearing a cloak. All the more ghostly it appeared, with the cloak sailing behind him in the wind like some devil's banner. Peter just stood transfixed as he watched the stranger come up the winding road to his house. Slamming the shutter, he hurriedly fastened it and then turned to the door to bolt that also. Too late. The door was thrown open, revealing a tall man cloaked in black. His face was wreathed in a wide grin, a grin that seemed to make fun of the grayish pallor of his face and the ominous appearance of his wild garb. Before the man stepped inside, Peter made a mental image of the scene, for it was to be firmly embedded in his mind so that he would never forget the slightest detail for the rest of his life. The wind blowing about the fierce visage, tossing up the long strands of hair, the massive, veined hand that clutched the wrought iron thumb latch, and the way the lamp struck his face, highlighting the thin, ridged nose and high cheekbones.
"Peter Scheinberger, eh?"
The man spoke in perfect German.
"Peter Scheinberger, the last of your clan here in America."
It was several seconds before Peter could muster up the courage to answer him. Drawing back slowly, he braced himself against the table, and in a thick, guttural German he asked, "Who are you?" The stranger shut the door and drew the bolt. He crossed the room, and with an air of one who was accustomed to having his own way wherever he went, scanned the shelves of Peter's larder with a practiced eye. Peter watched him closely as he drew down a bottle of wine, broke the neck against a beam above him, and settled down in Peter's easy chair. He poured a glassful and shoved it across the table toward the anxious Peter, and then poured another glass for himself.
Mirestone, the stranger finally answered. Martin G. Mirestone.
Then draining his glass, he added,
Student of German history.
All this was beyond Peter's comprehension. No one ever had the audacity to walk into his house and help himself to whatever he wanted. He was indeed unheard of in his tiny social world.
Well, what are you staring at?
Mirestone boomed out.
Take my cloak, please, then be seated. We'll talk.
Taking the cloak and draping it over a wooden peg in the wall, Peter moved cautiously around the foreboding character that monopolized his small house. Carefully seating himself opposite the man, he moved the table so that it sat between them as a protective barrier.
I'll make myself clear to you, Mirestone explained, for I want my stay to be as brief as possible.
He poured himself another glass of wine, then settled back in the chair, half closing his eyes.
You see, I am a student, you might say, of German history or folklore. I am in the process of writing a collective history of the Pennsylvania Dutch folk, their habits, beliefs, and...
He broke off for an instant as he leaned forward across the table, staring into the frightened eyes of Peter.
And their superstitions.
Shifting his chair around in order to get benefit from the heat of the fireplace, Mirestone went on.
Now I want facts, Scheinberger, authentic facts. I am prepared to pay you well for your trouble, but I insist on information that is backed up with sound, accurate truth.
Peter became more relaxed, but still slightly uneasy. He didn't like the attitude of this man, Mirestone. He was too sure of himself, altogether too cocky. But then on the other hand, he had said there would be a financial gain from any business that he could transact with him. Money was something that Peter knew he needed in order to keep his farm going, and any income, however small it may be, would be welcomed gratefully. Yes, he decided, he had better endure the rudeness of this man. For a few seconds, however, the tall stranger seemed to lose all of his cockiness, and a somber look crept over his jovial features.
Have you ever heard of the hex of the white feather?
Peter thought a moment before he replied, Yes, I have heard of it. Then nervously, he fingered his glass of wine he had not as yet touched. Raising it up to his lips, he sipped it slowly as he stared at Mirestone over the rim of the glass.
Yes, I have heard of it, he repeated. Good. You have heard of it. Now you will tell me about it, of course. I want to know all about it. How it is practiced, the results, and so forth. Is that why you came by? Only to learn of the white feather hex?
Mirestone climbed to his feet and paced the room.
Yes, he said.
Peter noted a sad tone in his voice, and he waited for him to say more.
Yes, Mirestone continued. I have, like you, heard of the hex of the white feather. I have traced it down to several families, but none could tell me anything about it that was factual. Half of the stupid fools made up stories as they went along, some concocting the biggest bunch of asinine tales that I've ever heard. But you, Peter, are a descendant of the Scheinbergers. I know for a fact that Otto Scheinberger practiced the white feather hex and passed the power on down to your father. From there it stopped. However, there must be some record of it in your family. You are in possession of the books of your grandfather, aren't you?
I have several of his books. Some of them I have read.
Well,
Mirestone waited.
Did you come across anything about the hex?
Yes, said Peter.
I read about that which you mentioned. Splendid. Now, we are getting somewhere. Can you find me the book that tells of it?
Peter finished drinking his wine, and setting the glass upon the table, he slowly rose and faced Mirestone with a look of superiority playing about his rustic features.
No, I'm afraid not. You see, I have burned the book.
Mirestone's face went white.
You burned it?
Yes, said Peter.
I don't wish to have anything to do with such black magic. It is better burned. But you must remember the hex. Although the book is destroyed, you still have the information in your head, nein?
I could never forget it if I wanted to, replied Peter reluctantly.
If I could burn my memory also, it would be better.
Mirestone went back to the fireplace and placed several trunks of wood on the blaze. A bright orange glow leapt out from the hearth and danced mockingly over his pallid brow, hiding his lank jowls in the shadows cast by the cheekbones. Like some grim spectre he rose up, towering above the little Dutchman. Peter had only to look into his eyes to see the imperative request that lingered behind the hollowed socket. Throughout the remainder of the night, Peter, almost in spite of himself, racked his brain to bring back to mind everything that was mentioned in the book about the hex of the white feather. The idea was clear enough, but the minute details, the infinite possibilities for mistakes, and the exacting specifications concerning the experiment were blurred in his memory. He knew that with time he could bring back everything that he had read, but it would take deep concentration and, perhaps, many days of trial and error to determine the right path that they must follow in order to have success. Mirestone, realizing that any distraction would break Peter's train of thought, sat quietly in the corner, finishing off the Dutchman's supply of wine. He watched Peter closely through his slitted eyes, and it seemed that his compelling stare was the only force that could drive the frightened Peter on. Every so often, Peter would glance up and see Mirestone leaning back in the corner, half concealed by the deep shadows. Only his partially opened eyes could be seen flickering in the fiery glow of the hearth. Then he would cover his face with his large knotted hands, work the twisted fingers through his hair, and try to bring back to mind the evil recipe. The glow from the fireplace gradually died down to make room for the streams of morning dawn. Peter blinked sleepily and got up to stretch a bit. Outside, the dull morning light worked its way over Peter's farm. Clouds of mist still poured up from the gorge, circling the bridge and creeping up the bank across the fields. Peter unlatched the heavy oaken door and went outside to the outbuildings. Meanwhile, Mirestone had started a fire in the stove and was placing slabs of bacon in the pan.
Nothing like a good old-fashioned peasant's breakfast, he laughed as Peter came in the door several minutes later. So you brought a goat, hey? He noticed. Are you figuring on starting in soon? Peter set a small kid on the floor and watched it scamper about the room, looking for an exit. Yes, we might as well. I don't like this business at all. I wish to get it over with as soon as possible, and Peter eyed Mirestone squarely. I expect to be paid well for my trouble. He was trying to make himself believe that that was his only reason for complying with Mirestone's demand. Actually, he was not so sure. As the heat of the noonday sun blasted down on their backs, Mirestone watched Peter pass a feather, freshly plucked from a white leghorn, under the nose of the bleeding kid. Mirestone listened carefully to what Peter was telling him. The breath of the victim had to be spread over the feather before anything further could be done. Tie him, commanded Peter. Mirestone held the goat by the scruff of his neck and fastened a halter about him. The other end was secured to a stake, allowing the kid to run about in a circle of 10 feet or so in diameter. We will leave him for a while, said Peter as he walked back to the kitchen. Mirestone followed in the Dutchman's footsteps, and when they were inside, he listened intently as Peter recited a monosyllabic chant over the feather. The chant is easy to learn, Peter assured him. You will master it quickly. I understand so far, Mirestone said. Then that is all, Peter finished, except that you can hang the feather up and watch it grow red. Red? Yes, Peter explained. That is the only way you can tell if the hex has worked. Peter went to a chest at the foot of his bed and drew out a small box of sewing utensils. He broke off a piece of black thread and replaced the box in the chest. Now I'll show you what I mean. Peter spoke warily as he tied the feather with the thread and suspended it from one of the rafters in the room. Just sit and watch. It was not many minutes before a light red tint crept up the feather's quill, spreading slowly outwards toward the fringed edges. Deeper and deeper grew the intensity of the color until it reached a pure blood red. Hurry, outside, cried Peter. You can see the goat in its last seconds of life. Mirestone hurried after the Dutchman. Jerking at the halter, the goat bleated in agony, prancing up and down frantically. Its eyes grew horribly bloodshot and finally closed. With a feeble, choking sigh, the animal dropped over on its side, its legs still twitching spasmodically. Mirestone bent over the hairy form and examined the head, now wet with perspiration. Nothing can be done for the beast? No. Peter looked on with a touch of pity in his eyes. Nothing can be done once the feather has turned red. As if the death of the kid was their cue, masses of thick thunderheads turned over with a deep rumbling thunder. The sky became crystal clear, and a greenish glow could be seen working its way across the horizon. The sky darkened as the glistening thunderheads, now taking on an ominous coloring, warned the farmers of the impending storm. It was later that evening. Rain drummed against the slate roof of Peter's house and reverberated through the rooms to where Mirestone and the Dutchman sat by the fire in silence. Mirestone broke the still atmosphere by putting forth a question that Peter somehow knew would be coming sooner or later. I wonder how the hex would react on a human being. Peter hoped to end the topic by answering him quickly and not beating around the bush by trying to evade the question. It would kill him eventually. Maybe not so quick as the goat, but it would kill him. What do you mean, not as quickly as the goat? Do you think it would take more time on a human? Perhaps. I have heard of cases in which the hex, once it was started, dragged on for many days. I see.
Mirestone sat back again, thinking to himself. Peter didn't like this. He wanted to get rid of Mirestone.
Well, you have your information. I showed you how the hex works, so why not pay me and leave?
Mirestone got up and laughed in the Dutchman's face. Crossing to the larder, he brought down a bottle, cracking the neck on the beam above, just as he had done the night before. A wave of apprehension overcame Peter as he realized the old flip attitude of Mirestone was coming back. That meant definite trouble, and Peter began to fear the consequences.
So why not pay me and leave? He again ventured. Or do you want something else?
Peter knew that he didn't need to ask that last question, for already he realized the grim experiment that was playing about in Mirestone's head.
Yes, I just told you what I wanted. I want to see the hex on a human before I go. Why? You have your information. Why do you want to see it work on a man? My stupid little peasant friend. Do I look like a student of history?
For the first time, Peter actually looked at Mirestone and saw him for what he was. Of course, he couldn't be a student. No student would act as he did, or even look as he did. The words jammed in his throat as he was about to voice a reply.
Ha! Martin G. Mirestone, student of history, student of German history. No, my little oxen friend, I am no more a student of history than you are, but I need the hex for other reasons which do not concern you.
Then, as if he were contemplating a great new joke, he continued,
But on the other hand, maybe the future of the White Feather Hex does concern you.
Mirestone's voice was drowned out by a heavy rumbling of thunder and the increased splashing of rain on the windows, but somehow Peter seemed not to notice. Somewhat later, Mirestone stepped quietly over to the sleeping form of his host. Peter had been over 24 hours now without sleep, and although the old Dutchman had tried desperately to fight off the drowsiness that had overcome him, the recent excitement of the day had finally taken its toll. Lightning struck nearby, followed with an ear-splitting blast that shook the house to its rocky foundations. Pieces of slate flew off the roof and were carried away into the night. The rain poured down in a great deluge, blurring the window, making it impossible to see in or out. Mirestone held out a glistening white feather in his long spidery fingers. He placed it within a few inches of Peter's nose and watched the delicate edges riffle in the Dutchman's breath. Crossing to the table, he leaned over the white fluff and breathed the short German incantation over it. How it glistened in the firelight. He bent closer and closer as he whispered the magic words that Peter had taught him, his breath ruffling the feather, playing about in the fringe softness. He hung up the feather by a thread and watched it hop back and forth in the center of the room. Peter awakened and saw Mirestone sitting by the fire, noting every movement of the feather.
What are you doing, eh?
Mirestone swung around and glared at the bleary-eyed Dutchman.
Sit down, he commanded. Sit down and watch the feather turn red.
Peter didn't need to be told that it was his feather. He knew by the merciless eyes of Mirestone that everything was over.
So, you were determined to find out what would happen if the hex were tried on a man?
Peter was surprised at how easily he took his fate. There was no need of excitement. This was his end, and there was no changing it.
Yes, I had to know, for I can't leave until I have a complete record of all the results.
Mirestone certainly was not cocky now. He looked almost ashamed of himself as he sat there nervously watching a man's fate swing by a silken thread.
I'm sorry, Peter, my friend, but that is how it must be. You are a stepping stone to a glorious reckoning that will soon take place. The hex of the White Feather. I can hardly believe that I have at last tracked it down, and you, Peter, are the last witness, the last link in the chain of those who know the secret. And how can it better end than by your becoming a part of the secret?
Peter realized that he had not much longer to live, and nothing he could do to Mirestone would change his fate. Perhaps he could save others, though.
What is this glorious reckoning you were speaking about? As soon as I see how your case ends, I'll be able to go ahead and release my vengeance on those stupid, bungling fools who have thwarted my progress in the black arts. They claim to speak in the name of humanity, no less. In that case, exclaimed Peter, I won't let myself be a foothold for your damned work. It is of the devil, and I'll have no part of it. Shut up, fool. You are a part of it already. Not if my body is destroyed before you get a hold of it.
Peter played his trump card. He quickly sprang back and slipped out of the door into the storm. Mirestone jumped up after him, but it was too late. He peered around in the raging tempest, making out the figure of Peter struggling with the hatch on the horse barn. He pulled his cloak about him and started towards Peter to stop him. The rain beat his face, blinding him momentarily, and before he could see clearly, a dark mass pounded by, swift hooves spattering mud all over him. Down the road sped Peter on the horse, down the road and towards the footbridge. Mirestone ran a few steps and halted. He heard the hollow staccato of horse hooves on the planks for an instant, followed by a splintering crash that rumbled up from the gorge. A long, guttural cry pierced the black gloom as man and horse plunged down to the seething death awaiting them. Cursing savagely, Mirestone trudged back through the rain to the house. He slammed the door shut and threw his cloak on Peter's bed. There was one more bottle on the shelf. He smashed the neck and poured a glass. If one can see him bent over the table, sending silent curses into his wine, he could readily imagine the feeling of defeat that had spread over Mirestone's countenance. The idiot of a Dutchman who had to play the hero's part and save other lives by ending his own made Mirestone fairly sick. However, all was not over. So the Dutchman had died. The hex had worked, a lot sooner than he had expected, though. Now he certainly would be delayed in his progress, for he had counted on examining the body for any traces left that would suggest something out of the ordinary. One thing, however, he had learned was that the hex at least worked on humans. The mangled body that was being washed over the rocks would be enough proof on that score. Mirestone poured another drink. He leaned back in the chair and placed the glass to his lips. He was tilted so far back that he raised the wine to a drinking position. It blocked his view of the room. As he slowly sipped it, however, the room began to come into view. The ceiling first, and slowly the wall. His eyes focused on a piece of thread hanging from the ceiling, and as the wine sank lower and lower in the glass, the thread grew longer and longer, until in one last swallow he was able to see the end of the line. Mirestone's hand went stiff as he looked at the thread, for on the end of it was a pure white feather. In an instant, Mirestone realized that the hex had not worked. Peter's death at the bridge had been a grotesque coincidence. Had the untimely plunge in the rapids been the result of the hex, the feather would have long since been red. Therefore, the tragedy was no more than an accident, and Mirestone's hands were innocent of the Dutchman's blood. That realization, of course, didn't bother him, for he was not concerned whether or not he was responsible for Peter's death, but he was genuinely worried in the failure of the hex. He wondered if he had done something wrong. If he had, the last link that could have corrected him was broken. From here on in, he was on his own. He calmed himself and began to think. He retraced everything that he had done to see if he couldn't have found some margin in which error could have crept in. He remembered how carefully he had bent over the feather, reciting the exact words taught him by Peter. He especially remembered that part of the hex, for hadn't the feather been ruffled by his breath when he spoke? Gradually, the truth began to dawn on Mirestone. His own breath must have released Peter from the hex. The last person's breath that touched the feather would feel the sting of the power. Mirestone sat back dumbfounded. He was to be his own guinea pig. What ghastly horror was he in for? Would he die quickly like that of the goat, or would his death be prolonged over a period of days like Peter had suggested? He gripped himself. It wouldn't do to lose control of his senses. There must be a way out of the predicament. But Peter said that as soon as the feather turned red, there was no turning back. Ah, there's the answer. The feather is still white. There's still a chance. Mirestone grabbed his cloak and raced for the door. He must get an animal, another goat perhaps, and expose the feather to its breath. He must hurry lest the spell will start working. The slippery mud dragged him back and impeded his progress, but he struggled on through the blinding storm towards the barn. It was so black outside that he could hardly make out the buildings. All at once he saw the barn looming ahead of him. Which door? Every second counted. He would try the first one he came to. Wait, what's that holding his cloak? Mirestone turned and fumbled with some barbed wire fencing. It had snagged him in the dark, and he soon became hopelessly entangled in it. Crying and shrieking, he tore the cloak from his shoulders and ran on in his shirt sleeves. He wrenched open a door and sprawled in the barn headfirst. On his hands and knees, he scurried across the mealy floor to the goat stall. The kid sprang in terror as he lurched in drunkenly, grabbing about in the dark for one of them. Catching one by the hind leg, he groped his way out again. Thrusting his shoulders forward, he slid through the gripping mud, tearing his way through the engulfing rain with his free hand, his leg numb from the wound inflicted by the barbed wire, and a trickle of blood was running down his shins. Without thinking, he reached down to rub the wound, but quickly yanked his hand up again. What was that horrible sensation he felt as he passed his hand over the fleshy sore? He couldn't see in the rain, but his leg told him that it was something hairy, almost bristly. He ran on towards the house, stumbling in the treacherous mud. Once he fell completely down in the slime. Wiping the dripping earth from his face, he was told again that something was wrong. His cheeks verified his shin's story of a rough, jagged caress. Holding his hand in front of his face, he saw, amidst a flash of lightning, a curling black claw, bristling with long, ragged hairs. Screaming hysterically, he dropped the kid and fell forward into the door of the house. The latch gave way with his weight, and he tumbled into the cottage. Dancing madly on the end of a thread was a blood-red feather.
The Fourth Dimension by Charles Ford. Ripley sang aloud in pure joy as the blade-like bow of his racing canoe slipped through the water. The wind was northwest and puffy, and the lake showed a lively blue and white under the sky. As he came about over to windward, he could see the green of the golf links slanting up from the water's edge, and the white clubhouse gleaming through the trees. Overhead, the white and tinted clouds sailed before the wind, hardly dimming the sunshine. It was a pretty picture from the water, and he loved it. As the wind heeled his canoe over, his muscular legs shot him up to windward, and the lively craft swished through the water, every puff wetting the sails halfway to their peaks, and showering him with spray. Golf and tennis were good, but nothing wiped out the worries of a difficult and precarious business as did the little canoe. It needed skill, muscle, and quick wits, a man's game. Starting his sheets a bit, he stood out into the lake and hauled her into the wind again. Then a vicious blast came down the hill and slide jammed, and he went over. The ducking was the least of his troubles. He was used to it. But this time something went wrong. His head struck a spar, and when at last he found himself swimming easily toward the boathouse that showed its gay awnings in the little cove below the clubhouse, he thought he must have been unconscious for a minute or two. Pulling himself up on the float, he turned, but could see nothing of the capsized canoe. "I'll send Jimmy out for it," he said to himself, and went into the locker room for a rub-down. It struck him as rather singular that when he went out, float and boathouse and locker room had been gay with multicolored canoes, and girls in summer dresses, and men talking over golf scores and exchanging alibis and experiences. Now everything was quiet, but for a few men he didn't know talking soberly in the locker room. "Well, that ducking took Miller off my mind for a while anyway. Queer that the crack on my skull didn't raise a lump," he mused, rubbing his head cautiously. Jimmy did not appear by the time Ripley had changed, and he took out his clubs and strolled up the slope to the first tee. He felt a little tired and dazed, and it might be amusing to watch them drive off. Perhaps he would feel like playing a few holes if some acquaintance showed up about the time Miller began pestering him again. But it wasn't the Miller business that puzzled him now. The tee was the same. Railing and water can and sandbox were just the way they belonged. The narrowing vista of the first fairway, with the green and its tiny flag perched on the knoll 400 yards away, were as usual. The long ranks of translucent clouds sailed down the wind, with their shadows flitting down the hill ahead of them, were just as they had looked from the lake. Out there, several racing canoes like his own danced over the whitecaps and heeled down before the puffs of wind. That puzzled him. His had been the only one of that type of canoe left on the lake, because they were thought pretty risky for such treacherous water. Golfers drove off, several foursomes, and passed on up the course, but he didn't seem to know one of them. They seemed to be having a good time, but there wasn't any of the usual loud chaffing and handicaps and bets. Even the caddies were subdued. Somehow, things were different. A tall man with a long, clean-shaven, pleasant face sat down beside him, nursing between his knees a formidable outfit of clubs. There was something about him that stirred Ripley's recollection, but he couldn't place him. Ripley nodded, however, and the stranger greeted him pleasantly. "I don't think I've met you before. You're Mr. Ripley, aren't you? My name's Longdon." Ripley startled a little. Where had he heard the name Longdon? There was a famous racing canoe man of that name, but somehow it stuck in Ripley's mind that the Longdon he was thinking of had been in the Navy during the war and had lost his life saving a lot of others from an explosion on board a destroyer. This man couldn't be the same Longdon. "Playing today?" asked Longdon. Ripley shook his head. "I thought I would, but I'm a little tired," he said. "Just had a bad spill on the lake, and my head doesn't seem quite right. Got a knock against the mast going over. I think I'll hunt up Jimmy and get him to go out after my canoe. If you don't mind, I'll walk down with you for a cigarette," Longdon said, and together they went down the slope to the boathouse, Longdon clipping dandelion heads with his putter as they strolled along. Ripley was aware of a certain restraint about his companion, as if he wanted to say something and didn't quite know how to go about it. They reached the landing and sat down on a bench, looking out over the water and smoking in silence. Suddenly, Ripley saw a queer thing. It seemed as if the pretty scene before them rolled aside, and out there was a dory where there had been no dory before. 3 men were in it, dragging for something in the lake, and alongside the dory was a capsized canoe, its green hull and a bit of white sail showing on the water. Longdon looked at him sympathetically, but Ripley didn't understand the look. "Why, that's my canoe," cried Ripley. "Jimmy must have... What in the world are they dragging for?" Longdon said, "It is your canoe. Don't you understand now?"
The Marrying Monster by Klaus Stamm, read by Quartertone. Goro put down his tools and relaxed into a pile of wood shavings, his back against a half-finished bathtub. To enjoy the evening cool, he told himself, wiping his face with a blue and white rag. Actually, he wanted to postpone the evening meal. Either the rice would be overcooked to a sticky goo, or he would be picking hard, underdone kernels out of his teeth all night. And bean soup, when he made it, always had things swimming in it that had no business there. A night insect went, "Weep, weep, weep." The sound, the night falling, and the thought of his own cooking made him think of his dead wife. "She was a good cook, poor thing," he thought out loud. My, how I miss her." He gave a deep sigh. Oh, to have a wife again, a jolly round wife, and a good cook, just like the old one, with perhaps the small exception that she would not eat a man out of house and home, and herself into the grave in the bargain. Had he said that out loud? Bad sign when a man talks to the night insects. Better to go into the house, better to eat rice and bean soup. He shuddered. He began to get up and paused halfway, one hand against the wood of the tub, the other shielding his eyes. He peered into the forest that came almost to the workyard. Someone was coming through there. He heard it. He sat down again. Fireflies flitted among the trees. What if it were his wife's spirit? Would it be a chubby ghost? It should be. A woman walked out of the forest. She was tall, he noticed, watching her thread her way among the finished and unfinished buckets and tubs, tall and slender, almost gaunt. She had her sleeves tied back out of the way with a white tasuki cord, as though ready for hard work, and her bare arms were wiry and capable looking. She bowed. Goro scrambled to his feet, catching a splinter or two in his shoulder on the way up. He bowed. "Good evening," said the woman. "Is this the house of Goro, the cooper who wants a wife that does not eat too much and is a good cook?" Goro's eyes crossed and his mouth fell open. His fingers scrabbled. "You do look unwell, like a starved goldfish," said the woman. I don't mean to be rude." "I haven't had dinner," said Goro, for want of anything brilliant to say. He felt wondrously helpless. Things like this did not usually come up in the tub-making business. "Naturally, poor thing. I'm sure you can't cook well either," said the woman, and Goro marveled however she had guessed it. "Well, I can cook. I can do the work of 3 women. Into the house with you now before you catch a cold. Shoo!" She drove him ahead of her into the house. "I would say I'm quite charming," she said, closing the door behind them, "when one gets used to me. As for my name, why, wife, I think, will do nicely." And sometime in the next few days, still with the feeling that he was being left out of things, Goro found himself married. The new wife was an excellent cook, and indeed did the work of 3 ordinary women. Dinner was never late, and the house was generally spotless. She spoke neither too much nor too little. On evenings, when Goro came home discouraged, she always had some good remark ready about the tub-making business, how much artistry and labor went into a good bucket, how unreasonably little money went to the hard-working artist, cheering things, flattering things. Goro gained weight and was not unhappy. At mealtimes, his wife ate a little more than a bird, but not quite so much as a large cat. The food bills went up and up. Goro gradually discovered that with the little eating going on, he was using up food at a rate to feed 6 or 7 coopers, together with a few aunts and uncles. "Curious," he muttered. "Very," and determined to investigate. One morning, he made a great fuss about getting measuring equipment together. He told his wife that he was going to a village half a day's walk away to take measurements for the village headman's new tub. Then he went a short distance into the forest and waited behind a tree. When he saw his wife go to a nearby meadow to gather mushrooms, he flitted around to the back of the house. Hiding his tools behind the rear door, he crept inside. He shinnied up the center pole and flattened out against one of the big ceiling beams, and waited. His wife came back and put on the fire the largest pot in the house. From the storage bins, she took about 5 pounds of rice and fell to washing it. She ladled out enough bean paste to fill nearly another big pot, and made bean soup. "Who," wondered Goro on his beam, "is she expecting, and how many of them?" He blinked again. His eyes rather rolled up. She had slid the kitchen door out of its frame and was using it for a dumpling factory, lining the dumplings up, lines and lines of rice dumplings like fat, well-paid soldiers. Then she stretched and peered about as if to make sure she had not forgotten something. Satisfied that she had not, she parted her hair and exposed the mouth in the center of her head. Goro made a circle of his thumbs and forefingers, trying to calculate the size of the thing, and nearly fell off his perch. It was fairly large. Into this crater, his wife pushed dumplings by 1s and 2s, and they disappeared. To make certain, she washed them down with all the bean soup, ladles of bean soup. When she had disposed of everything, she waited a moment, expectantly. A cheery, satisfied rumble came from the top of her head. "Burps, too," thought Goro. "A regular volcano. Wonder if there'll be smoke." He was too interested to be frightened. But nothing further happened. She bound her hair back neatly, smiled, and left the house on some errand like any good wifely wife. Goro slipped down and out of the house, picking up his tools on the way. He went back into the forest, found a comfortable tree, and sat down against its trunk to smoke his tiny pipe and think. I must have married one of the monsters the priests and old men talk about. A Yamamba. A mountain mother. He nodded, bit his lip, and squinted his eyes. Now why do you suppose they call them that? He asked a squirrel that sat upright near his left foot, like an attentive, furry little doctor. They come from the mountains, fine, but what's motherly about them I do not understand. Squeep! Said the squirrel, and ran halfway up the tree. From there it peered down and examined Goro's head. He tilted his head back so that the squirrel could get a better look, and told it that, at any rate, this was no kind of wife for a good man. Then he stood up and began to walk home, looking down at the ground, kicking thoughtfully at fallen leaves, and occasionally scratching his head. He came out from among the trees and across the yard of his home, dragging his feet like a man who has walked a long way. He started speaking as soon as he put down his tools. Wife, I have been thinking about our marriage, and it hurts me to say it, you understand, but it was too sudden. No, don't interrupt, he said, though his wife had shown no sign of breaking in. I'm very sorry, but I feel that we're simply not suited to each other. All right, husband, I'll leave, she answered in quite an ordinary voice, even if it makes me unhappy. Could you do only one thing for me before I go? Nothing much. I'd like you to make me a tub as a kind of souvenir. A very large one for bathing in. The simplest thing in the world, said Goro, glad to get off so easily. I have one ready, as it happens. The very one I was sitting against when you came out of the forest. A very sound tub, one of my best. It has a lid, I hope, she said. All of my tubs have lids, said Goro. Well-fitting lids. Water stays warm in my tubs, even without a fire once that lid is on. Come, I'll show it to you. He led her out to the tub. See, there's the lid, right up against it, he said, thumping the tub with his fist. Feel that wood. Isn't it a beauty? She looked into the tub and agreed that it was getting harder and harder to find real quality in tubs. Too bad there's that large hole in it, she said. Hole? Said Goro. Hole? A hole in one of my tubs? Impossible. Where's that hole? He put his hands on the edge to raise himself and peered over. There, bottom right, she said. Can't you see it? Oh, the bottom, said Goro, leaning further over the edge. It's too dark to... She seized Goro's trousers in a firm grip and heaved. See, he finished at the bottom of the tub. He was still wondering how he had gotten down there when the lid came down, bang, and it grew very dark. He felt the tub sail up, come to rest on something, and begin to move forward with an up and down rocking movement. It did not take Goro long, in his bucket-shaped night, to realize that the Yamamba, having no further reason to pretend a feminine weakness she probably despised anyway, had placed the tub on her head and was on her way home. To the mountains. Excuse me, he called out. Where are we going? To dinner, came his former wife's voice through the wood. It grated unpleasantly. He decided to ask no more questions. Deep into the woods went the Yamamba, cutting through thicket and underbrush, the tub jouncing easily on her head, up and up into the mountains. Tireless on her long, rangy legs, she traveled along dead, forgotten roads lined with gnarled, ugly trees. Goro heard their branches bump, crack, bump against his self-made prison. A thin edge of lesser darkness began to show at the top. He hoped it was the first time the lid had slipped on a tub made by Goro. This sort of thing could ruin years of reputation. But it might mean a way out of the tub. The opening grew wider. Looking up, he was able to see a few stars. Did he imagine it, or was the tub slowing down? He hoped he was not going to be eaten immediately. The tub stopped and settled. Something rough, twisted, and snake-like appeared in the opening. It did not move. Nothing moved. He put out his hand. It was a branch. He gave the branch a delicate jiggle. It felt solid. The Yamamba, he guessed, must have tired and sat down to rest against a tree. Very cautiously, he lifted himself by the branch, trying to move neither the lid nor the tub, which must still be resting on the monster's head. He heard a faint snore. Top or forward mouth, he wondered. He pulled himself to his feet, trying not to breathe, and at last stood up with his head out of the tub. The branch was thick, and the next branch right above looked dependable. Healthy wood. He appreciated that. Then came a few feet of bark. That would be hard climbing, but above that, 4 or 5 branches, almost a ladder. Further, it was too dark to see. He tensed, took a deep breath, then gave a push and sent the heavy lid crashing down on the sleeping Yamamba. Up she leaped, and the tub went flying, but Goro was already climbing from branch to branch. In a nearby tree, some monkeys woke up and watched Goro's footwork with shame and envy. From the ground, the Yamamba stared up at him. It was a rare chance to see just what a Yamamba really wore for a face, and he decided it was not very attractive. Down below, the monster was letting down her horrible hair in a businesslike manner. "Dinner will be early," she said with a ghastly, girlish laugh. "I was getting quite hungry." She started up the tree, the top mouth opening and closing. There were teeth in it. "We Yamamba are very good with trees," she said, climbing steadily. "Don't climb any higher. It will only make you tired and sweaty and bitter to the taste. Say prayers instead and become calm and delicious." "I hope I burn your tongue if you have one in there," said Goro, a little beside himself. "And try not to be such a chatterbox. You're making my head buzz." He did hear a distinct buzzing, a small roaring right by his head where he was holding on to a thin branch. He tried to move his hand away from the sound. Something small sat down on his thumb and set it to fire. "Youch!" he said loudly. "Tee-hee-hee," went the Yamamba, coming up with an intimate rustling of leaves. Goro sucked his thumb, which had swollen surprisingly, and stared at the ball-like thing hanging only an arm's length away. The buzzing came from it. Very carefully, he reached out to see if he would be able to grab it instantly. He thought the size would be about right. A hard, scaly hand with claws came groping through the branches. He moved his foot out of the way and waited for her head. It appeared, the top mouth gaping. "Tee-hee-hee," said the Yamamba, using both mouths. "Tee-hee-hee yourself," said Goro. "Have a goodie." And into the top of her head he dropped the buzzing ball. "Whatever it was, it had a bad taste, and your blood will wash it away," said the Yamamba. But just then the hornets woke up, highly irritated from lack of sleep. They flew round and round inside the Yamamba. A few of them tickled, most of them stung, and all of them together worked a havoc in the delicate equipment that makes up the Yamamba interior. The Yamamba made a noise like a frying, and a noise like a boiling, and a noise like nameless things running through the night with their ears on fire. She tumbled from the tree into the tub waiting below and bounced about inside it, making unpleasant sounds too numerous to mention. Goro followed, but more slowly. He arrived in time to see the tub skipping and hopping at the edge of the road, which at that point was quite narrow. It teetered for a moment, and then sailed out in a gracious curve, trailing its uproar behind it. Goro kneeled and peered down. It was very dark. From far below came a soft bumpity-bump, then a mere whisper of a crash. Goro got up, shaking his head. He dusted his knees and went away down the road, growing smaller in the cold, lonely night.
By night, he plied his revolting quest, and by day, he trafficked with ghouls. The Fiend of the Seine, by Dick Hine. On the banks of the Seine, not far from where the famous avenue crosses it on a famous bridge, there is a small stone house, gray and inconspicuous among its surroundings. Here there lived, entirely alone, Jules Deroyle. He was about 50 years old and had a kind face, covered with short, stubby beard. He wore rough riverman's clothes, a black cap, and smoked a straight black pipe. His house, which faced the river, had a small boat tied up in front of it. By day, the boat was always there, and Jules at home. By night, the boat was absent, and Jules in it, paddling up and down the river, sometimes 3 miles from home. Before daybreak, he would return and tie up the boat. Then he would carry into his house a big black sack, bulging with contents, the nature of which could not be told by looking at it. Only Jules Deroyle knew what was in the sack. During the day, several fine automobiles with chauffeurs would stop in the street not far away, and men would come and enter Jules' house. After a few minutes, they would emerge carrying something wrapped in old newspapers. The men were generally well dressed and had sharp, neatly trimmed beards. Some wore eyeglasses and silk hats and looked distinguished. The police had investigated these activities several times, but found nothing wrong with them. Once they had held up Jules with his sack. It had contained firewood and old shoes, and stuff he had been gathering in the river. Again they had accosted the visiting gentlemen and examined their packages. The packages held lily bulbs and small plants in pots. They did not bother Jules and his visitors any more. Moreover, since the men were all prominent, perhaps they had influence with the prefect, and the gendarmes were given secret instructions not to be too inquisitive. Jules' strange doings went on for years before their tragic ending, and even the sharp-eyed neighbors had no clue to the mystery of the black sack. One afternoon, an automobile arrived, and a man got out. He was tall, handsome, and elegant. He entered Derolle's house. The room in which he was received was simply furnished. It was lighted by 2 windows, each looking upon the river, and the waters began just below the outside. There was a fireplace and a bright wood fire. A small kettle hung near the fireplace. Some heavy sticks were piled nearby for fuel. On the wall near the fireplace was placed a long, heavy knife, such as is used for chopping up firewood. A shelf at one end of the room was lined with packages of something wrapped in newspapers. The bulging black sack stood in one corner. A table sat in the middle of the floor. Jules Deroyle was smoking by the fire, and 2 empty chairs were close by. "How do you do, Dr. Mound?" he said as the man entered. "Sit down." "Good afternoon, Monsieur Deroyle. I see I am earlier than our friend Dr. Legile." "He won't be long in coming. In fact, I think I hear his car now." A minute later, another man entered. He was shorter than Dr. Mound and less handsome, but looked distinguished. "Good afternoon," he said as he sat down before the fire. "I suppose we 3 are alone, are we, Monsieur Deroyle?" observed Dr. Mound. "Quite. We may discuss our business or whatever we like." "I must say we are a bloody lot, after all, we doctors," laughed Dr. Mound. "I can hardly say which is the most ungodly, our calling or that of Jules Deroyle." Dr. Legile laughed, and Deroyle smiled and said nothing. "There is another ungodly thing about you, Legile," continued Dr. Mound. "I hear you have disowned your daughter. Is it true?" true indeed. I deeply regret it, but it was unavoidable. She was in love with a spendthrift. Her surreptitious conduct defied conversation, and she would not even disclose the man's name. But I heard a similar tale on you. Is it true also? It is, said Dr. Mound. I have disinherited my son for spending his time and my money on a girl whom the family has never seen. He refused to introduce any of us and has never revealed her name. Very sad. We should both be ashamed of ourselves, said Dr. Leglee. And Jules Derole here should be ashamed of himself too. Look at him. He makes his living by paddling up the Seine at night and gathering up the bodies of the suicides of Paris who die by drowning. He cuts off their heads or cuts out their hearts or whatever we doctors want. He puts them into a sack and brings them home. We come and buy them to dissect and experiment with for the ultimate benefit of humanity. Bloody business for all concerned, remarked Derole. What did you find last night? Asked Dr. Leglee. 4 adult bodies and 3 castaway babies. A good night's work. Did you bring them back? I brought the 4 big heads and the 3 little bodies. Give us 2 heads apiece. We shall call tomorrow for the babies. Derole arose and went to the sack in the corner. He stooped and took something from the sack. Let's see the heads before you wrap them, said Leglee, rising. Jules Derole handed him a woman's head, holding it out to him by the long brown hair. Dr. Leglee took it carelessly. Almost at the same moment, as Dr. Mound rose, Derole handed him the man's head. Mound reached unconcernedly for it. Suddenly his face turned pale, his breath came in gasps, and he staggered against the wall by the fireplace, trembling in every limb. The rush of blood to his eyes was so great that for a moment he could not see, but when his vision cleared, he looked at Leglee. Dr. Leglee stood in the middle of the floor with a head dangling in his hands. His eyes were closed, and he was breathing hard and swaying back and forth on his feet. He let fall the head and dashed his palms over his face. That instant, Jules Derole knew what he had done. He had handed Leglee his daughter's head, and Mound that of his son. The unhappy couple had committed suicide together. He looked from one doctor to the other. The doctors felt almost the same reaction. They saw the utter horror of their whole lives, the far pit into which their minds had hurled them. The brutality of Jules Derole also flashed home to them. They were seized with a simultaneous desire to kill him. Derole was strong, and his muscles hard from the daily paddling, but he was no match for the half-crazed and infuriated doctors. They banged him around the room, overturning the furniture and making considerable noise. One doctor held him by the throat. The other plucked a flaming stick from the fire and thrust it into his face. Derole screamed, a horrible scream. The heavy knife by the fire was next in Leglee's hands, and the head of the fiend soon fell to the floor. The body sagged and tumbled into a heap. Scarcely had the murder been committed when the door of the house burst open, and the gendarmes rushed into the room. They had been sent for by the nearest neighbor who had heard the screams and sounds. Dr. Glee and Dr. Mound were never tried for the murder of Jules Derole. The grievous nature of the affair worked in their favor. The public was satisfied that the mystery of the numerous headless bodies found in the river was cleared up, and some newspapers even congratulated the physicians for ridding Paris of the fiend of the Seine.
The Dangerous Scarecrow by Carl Jacobi. They were 2 very ordinary straw men on adjacent farms.
Nice playmates for a couple of imaginative kids. Then Jimmy gave a knife to The Dangerous Scarecrow by Carl Jacobi. Both Mr. Maudsley and Mr. Trask were resplendent that October evening. Mr. Maudsley stood deep in the cornfield, overall trousers ballooning in the wind, one hand nailed to a pie tin that caught the moonlight and reflected it like a mirror, while across the road the hat of Mr. Trask was bright with the strip of foil Jimmy had fastened to it that morning. From the rear seat of the car, Jimmy looked down upon the two figures as the road wound between the shocked fields. Next to him, his sister Stella said, "Mr. Trask looks fine tonight. I think he likes the silver ribbon you gave him." Jimmy nodded. "Mr. Maudsley looks good too. See the way his hand shines?" In the driver's seat, as he twisted the wheel to avoid a rut in the road, gray-haired Mr. Tapping coughed and glanced at his wife. "What are those kids whispering about?" The whispers died abruptly, and the car rattled over Goose Creek Bridge and began the long climb to the Tapping farm. They stopped at the roadside mailbox, but there was no mail. Then they were rolling up the cedar-lined lane, past the silo, past the barn, into the farmyard. Stella went into the house with her mother, but Jimmy remained with his father to open the garage doors. He snapped the big padlock shut after the car was put away, made a vain attempt to catch Higgins, the cat, and followed Mr. Tapping up the porch steps into the house. Upstairs in his room half an hour later, he undressed reluctantly and climbed into bed, wide awake. He lay there listening to the old house creak and groan in the night wind. From the distance came the mournful wail of a train whistle. Presently Jimmy got out of bed, crossed to the window, and stood looking out into the moonlight. Below him he could see his ball bat leaning against a tree, looking strangely white against the shadows. Beyond was the outline of a mounted horseman, the pump, and beyond that the gray circular walls of the silo pointed upward like a castle tower. Something caught Jimmy's eye, made him look to the east. He looked again, then moved to the table and rummaged through the drawer until he found the silver spyglass his father had given him last Christmas. He carried the glass back to the window, pushed the window open, and peered out. In the bright moonlight he could see Mr. Maudsley clearly, and a little farther on he could see Mr. Trask, two silent figures alone in the cornfields. The boy lowered the glass, wiped the lens on his sleeve, and carefully focused again. A puzzled frown furrowed his face. Save for the flapping of his trousers in the wind, Mr. Maudsley stood motionless, as of course he should. But Mr. Trask? A passing cloud slid over the moon, darkening the landscape. In the few seconds before it brought complete blackness, Jimmy thought he saw Mr. Trask kick up his heels, leap high in the air, and begin to dance a rigadoon over the shocked corn. At breakfast next morning, Jimmy waited impatiently for his sister to come downstairs. He hoped she would get to the table before his father, because with Papa present, he couldn't talk, and he wanted to talk. When at last Stella took her chair, he stretched his foot under the table and kicked her slightly. "I've got a secret," he whispered. "Tell it to me," said Stella. "It's a big secret. If you won't tell, I won't give you any of my Flinch candy." Jimmy was silent a moment as he gave this thought. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "Mr. Trask moved last night." "He always moves," replied Stella, unimpressed. "I mean really moved, toward Mr. Maudsley." Stella choked on her porridge, and the spoon all but slipped from her hand. She stared with wide-open eyes. "He didn't." Their whispers broke off as Mr. Tapping strode across the kitchen and took his place at the head of the table. A heavy-set, unimaginative man who seldom entered into conversation with the children, he eyed them speculatively. But he said nothing and began to eat his eggs and thick strips of bacon. He ate slowly and methodically, keeping his eyes to the table. When he had finished his coffee, he settled back to light his pipe. He passed the match back and forth across the bowl with quiet deliberation. Who's Mr. Maudsley and who's Mr. Trask? His wife smiled. Those are just the names the children have given the scarecrows. What scarecrows? The one in our field and the one on Edmund's land. Mr. Tapping considered this while strong curls of strong tobacco smoke rose about him. Why those names? Why not Brown and Smith? Because those are their names, explained Stella patiently. Mr. Tapping cogitated on the mysteries of the juvenile mind. Abruptly he remembered the section of pasture fence that needed repairing and got to his feet. But it was nearly noon before he got around to fence fixing, and then he had but one wire stapled when he heard a "Halloo!" and turning saw old Jason Southby hobbling across the field toward him. Jimmy, who was holding the wire for his father, let go the pliers and joined Stella, who was trying to capture a bumblebee in a fruit jar. "Howdy," said old Jason, reaching the fence. "Got a couple of helpers, I see." Mr. Tapping smiled and nodded his greeting. "I came over to ask if you're going to post your property for no huntin' this year." "Don't think so," replied Mr. Tapping. "Aren't many grouse, and I don't expect there'll be many hunters." "No," agreed old Jason. "The birds are dying out. It ain't like the old days." Mr. Tapping nodded. "Remember when Maudsley was here? Things was different then." "Who did you say?" said Mr. Tapping. "Maudsley," repeated old Jason. "He owned your farm 20-30 years ago." Mr. Tapping shook his head. "Maudsley, eh? Jimmy and Stella must have heard the name from one of the neighbor's children." "Yep," continued old Jason. "Maudsley had this place, and Trask rented the strip across the road. So, quite a story about them two." Mr. Tapping said nothing. There would be no hurrying old Jason, and no stopping him either. The man obviously had a tale to tell, and he was enjoying every moment of this prelude. He bit off a piece of plug tobacco, chewed a moment, and spat. "It was corn that started it," he said. "Maudsley was a great one to fool around with hybrids, and he worked out an early variety he called Maudsley No. 2. That ain't been planted anymore, but in those days it was well thought of." Then Trask moves into the farm across the road. Trask was from down south, from around New Orleans way, and he was fired up with all sorts of backwoods stuff. Pretty soon he began to fight with Maudsley about how good his hybrid corn was. Seems Trask believed the only way to grow good crops was by using voodoo spells. Got so them two couldn't come into sight of each other without starting an argument. One day Trask got so mad he let his cattle loose in Maudsley's cornfield. That settled it. Maudsley headed for Trask's place, armed with a double-barreled shotgun. But before he got there, Trask made himself invisible. "He did what?" demanded Mr. Tapping. "Well, anyway, that's the story Maudsley spread around. Funny thing is, folks believed him. He said Trask, been from New Orleans country, knew all sorts of voodoo spells. And he said that Trask, been afraid, had cast a spell over himself to make himself vanish. Course, some persons were suspicious, and the sheriff asked Maudsley some questions. But Maudsley proved his shotgun hadn't been fired, and no one had seen him commit any crime. Trask was never seen around these parts again. After that, Maudsley got to actin' sort of queer, looking over his shoulder, talking to himself. Then one day he up and cleared out, and the next anything was heard of him, he had moved south to New Orleans, the very place Trask had come from. Maudsley is still down there. He wouldn't come back even long enough to complete the sale of his farm. Jason's voice died off as he reached the end of his story. "Did you hear what he said?" said Jimmy in a low voice. "Sure." Stella rose triumphant from capturing her bumblebee. "I knew it all the time." It rained the next night, and even with the spyglass, Jimmy could see nothing in the cornfields. But he knew the two scarecrows were out there, and he could imagine them standing in the rain with beads of water dripping from their hats. The muddy water would be running in rivulets between the rows of shocked corn, and when the lightning flashed, the shocks would gleam dully like so many stacked guns at an army encampment. Next day after lunch, Jimmy drew his sister aside. "If you don't tell anybody, I'll show you the present I've got for Mr. Maudsley. Promise?" "I promise," said Stella. Jimmy led the way into the barn, and in the rear near one of the horse stalls, swept aside a covering of hay. He picked up a long rusty knife and displayed it with an air of pride. Stella was disappointed. "Just an old knife. It's a voodoo knife, that's what it is. See the way the handle is carved?" Stella looked and saw a yellowed handle of what once might have been ivory, carved in the shape of a running goat with several quasi-human faces low down near the hilt. "What are you going to do with it?" she said. "I told you, give it to Mr. Maudsley. It's his." "How do you know it's his?" "This is Mr. Maudsley's barn, isn't it? Besides, it was near his other stuff." Stella was not enthusiastic. "Papa won't like it. He got mad when you nailed that pie tin to Mr. Maudsley's hand." "Papa won't know a thing about it. Come on." It was hot in the cornfield. The morning sun beat down fiercely, and the air smelled of damp earth. The ground between the rows of stubble was marked with tiny channels the running water had cut the night before. But the shocks were dry again, and in the slight breeze they whispered and rustled gently. The two children made a beeline for the center of the field until they came to the two crossboards that served as a framework for the scarecrow. The scarecrow was fashioned of some old clothing which had once belonged to a fat man, overalls, a coat of what might have been a Sunday suit at one time, and an ancient felt hat, castaways which the children had found in the barn. The cardboard face, marked in black crayon, a little blurred now from the rain, had been copied by Jimmy from an old photograph the boy had come upon among some old papers when he had cleaned out the attic. Jimmy had decided that even a crow wouldn't be fooled by a faceless scarecrow. Jimmy was about to climb the upright shaft when Stella stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Let's not give Mr. Maudsley the knife." "Why not? It's his. Let's give it to Mr. Trask." The boy's jaw dropped as the enormity of the idea grew upon him. Then he uttered a squeal of delight. Laughing and giggling, the two children turned and ran down and vaulted the fence that enclosed the Isle of Shocks to the road and adjacent field. 5 minutes later, the second scarecrow brandished a knife at the end of one of its handless sleeves. But as Jimmy came out on the road again, he looked across at Mr. Maudsley. In full view in the sunlight, it wasn't a cardboard face now. It was a round, full face with great folds of fat, and it was twisted in an expression of stark fear. For 3 nights, the skies over the Tapping farm were black, and a cold wind huffing down from the north kept the children indoors, where they played endless games of parcheesi. On the 4th night, the moon broke through the clouds. Jimmy, squatting by the window, the spyglass to his eye, stared out at the two scarecrows. At intervals, he thought he saw Mr. Trask descend from the mounting pole, leap up over the shocks, and begin his strange dance. But at the instant those capers began, the clouds always managed to blot out the light, and the boy never could be sure if it was a trick of his eye or the glass. And then Jimmy observed two things. With him and his gyrations, Mr. Trask carried the knife, and as he darted back and forth, he edged almost imperceptibly toward Mr. Maudsley. The boy watched a long time to confirm his fears. Then he turned and ran to his sister's room. "Mr. Trask is getting closer," he said. "You'd better come see." At the window, Stella spent several moments focusing the glass. Slowly her body went rigid, and she uttered a hoarse exclamation. "He's gonna kill Mr. Maudsley." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with terror. "We've got to try and stop him." She turned and ran down the stairs and through the lower floor rooms to the back door. Jimmy ran after her. Crossing the yard, they sped halfway down the lane, then pushed through the cedar windbreak and veered toward the cornfield. Pumpkins, golden in the moonlight, rose up on either side as they raced up the incline. Suddenly Stella drew up short. "Look!" Mr. Trask had crossed the road and now was coming full tilt through the row of shocks. Jimmy, arms spread wide, threw himself forward to block the onrushing figure's path. He had a brief impression of a blurred shadow bowling toward him and passing through him while he struck out with his small fists ineffectually. Behind there was a ripping of cloth and a hoarse scream. Stella came running to where Jimmy stood. Together they saw two shadows locked in an incredible embrace. Like a scythe raised aloft, Mr. Trask's knife swept downward in a wide arc and with a quick stroke cut off Mr. Maudsley's head. Mr. Maudsley's hat flew up, Mr. Maudsley's head rolled off, and a thin cry of triumph welled up and faded. And then there was nothing, except that Mr. Trask was back on one side of the fence, and Mr. Maudsley was on the other, minus his head, of course. "Gee," said Stella. "Golly," said Jimmy. He ran over to pick up Mr. Maudsley's hat. Jimmy tried to put Mr. Maudsley's head back, but somehow it wouldn't stick. "We'll fix it in the morning," said Jimmy. At the edge of the field, Jimmy paused and caught his sister's arm anxiously. "You won't tell, Stella?" "No, of course not." "Cross your heart?" "Cross my heart and hope to die." It was night of the next day, and the children sat playing parcheesi. Mrs. Tapping was knitting. Mr. Tapping, settled back in the platform rocker, was reading the newspaper aloud as was his custom. Outside, Mr. Trask was in one field, and Mr. Maudsley was in the other. His head was back in place, but only tied on. It was not the same. It looked very dead, even though Jimmy and Stella had done their best. "Any news?" asked Mrs. Tapping. "Same old stuff. New taxes, one of them foreign countries, talking big and threatening war," said Mr. Tapping. "One thing here, though, they found a fellow with his head cut off, right in the middle of a city street." "My land! Not here in Acrestown." Mr. Tapping laughed. "Lord, no. Happened way down in New Orleans."